In the autumn of 1887, a clerk at the Monroe County Courthouse in Madisonville, Tennessee, recorded 4 deaths in the span of 11 days. The names on the certificates belonged to a single family, the Mercers of Bell's Hollow, a small settlement nestled in the foothills east of the Tellico River. Silas Mercer, aged 58, died on the 3rd of October. His wife Eleanor, aged 53, on the 7th. Their son Thomas, 30, on the 10th. Their daughter Ada, 26, on the 14th. The causes listed range from gastric fever to cardiac failure to a vaguely noted respiratory collapse. Nothing about the paperwork suggested foul play, and the attending physician, a respected local doctor named Lawrence Hodge, had signed each certificate without notation or reservation. The county processed the documents in the ordinary course of business, and Nathaniel Mercer, cousin to Silas and the family's longtime accountant, presented himself at the courthouse on the 20th of October with a sheaf of papers granting him authority to settle the estate. Within 30 days, the Mercer property, 240 acres of timberland, a working sawmill, a 2-story farmhouse, and various outbuildings, had been sold to a consortium of investors based in Knoxville. The price was approximately 1/3 of its assessed value. The furniture was removed during a single night in early November. By December, the surname Mercer had all but vanished from the local newspapers, the church rolls, and the oral memory of Bell's Hollow. It might have remained an unremarkable tragedy of disease and misfortune, the kind of story that rural communities absorb and forget. Had it not been for a detail that refused to settle into the past, 3 of the 4 death certificates had been prepared before the dates on which, according to multiple sworn statements, those same individuals had last been seen alive. Bell's Hollow had never been a place that attracted much attention from the outside world. The settlement occupied a narrow valley where the foothills of the Unicoi Mountains began their slow rise toward the North Carolina border, and its residents made their living from timber, subsistence farming, and the occasional trade that drifted along the old wagon road connecting Madisonville to the Cherokee National Forest lands to the east. The Mercer family had been part of that landscape for 2 generations, having arrived in the 1840s when Silas Mercer's father, a Virginian of modest means, purchased a tract of woodland and built the first steam-powered sawmill in the eastern half of the county. By the time Silas assumed control of the operation in the mid-1850s, the Mercer name carried weight in the hollow. The sawmill employed 14 men during peak season. The family attended the Methodist Church in Tellico Plains every Sunday. Silas served 2 terms on the county's road commission. Neighbors described the Mercers as reserved but dependable, the kind of people who paid their debts on time and kept their business to themselves. The farmhouse stood at the end of a gravel lane, half a mile from the main road, partially obscured by a stand of old-growth oak and hickory that Silas had never permitted to be cut. It was a 2-story structure of timber frame construction, painted white at some point in the 1870s, but already peeling in long grey strips by the summer of 1887. A covered porch ran the length of the front facade, and a stone chimney rose from the eastern gable. Behind the house, a path led through a tangle of blackberry bushes to the sawmill, which sat on the bank of a shallow creek that fed into the Tellico River system about 3 miles downstream. The mill operated from dawn until dusk during the warm months, and the rhythmic shriek of the circular saw blade cutting through pine and cedar logs provided a constant backdrop to life on the property. Eleanor Mercer, who managed the household accounts and kept the ledgers for the mill, could be seen most afternoons walking between the house and the mill office with a leather satchel of receipts and pay envelopes tucked under her arm. She was a woman of medium height, with dark hair drawn back in a tight bun, and she spoke in the measured, deliberate manner of someone who had learned early in life that words, like money, should not be spent carelessly. The couple's two children had remained on the property well into adulthood. Thomas, the elder at 30, had taken over the day-to-day operation of the sawmill from his father in 1884 after Silas began to complain of persistent fatigue and shortness of breath. He was a broad-shouldered man with his mother's dark eyes and his father's tendency toward long silences, competent with machinery and respected by the mill hands, though several of them later recalled that he had grown noticeably distracted during the summer of 1887. Ada, 4 years younger at 26, had trained as a pharmacist's assistant under a Mr. Horace Webb in Madisonville, and divided her time between Webb's apothecary shop and the family home. She was the only Mercer who spoke easily with strangers, and the only one who had ever expressed a desire to leave Bell's Hollow permanently. The fifth member of the household, at least for practical purposes, was Nathaniel Mercer. He was not a resident of the farmhouse, but lived in a rented room above a dry goods store in Tellico Plains, and he arrived at the Mercer property every morning at 7 o'clock without fail. Nathaniel was a second cousin to Silas, the son of Silas's late uncle Edmund, and he had been brought into the family business in 1879 after a series of failed ventures in Chattanooga left him without prospects. He kept the ledgers, negotiated with timber buyers, handled correspondence with suppliers in Knoxville and Asheville, and gradually insinuated himself into nearly every aspect of the Mercer enterprise. Nathaniel was 44 years old in 1887, a man of average height and unremarkable appearance, whose most distinguishing feature was a pair of spectacles with thin gold frames that he polished obsessively with a cloth he kept in his vest pocket. He spoke in a soft, agreeable voice that put people at ease, and he was known to bring small gifts, a bag of peppermints, a newspaper from Knoxville, when he visited the homes of business associates. No one in Bell's Hollow could later recall ever having seen Nathaniel Mercer angry or drunk or in any way out of control. This fact, in retrospect, became one of the most unsettling details of the entire affair. The first external sign that something had shifted within the Mercer family appeared in the spring of 1887, though almost no one outside the household recognized it at the time. A representative of the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad, a Mr. Arthur P. Denby, arrived in Madisonville in April and began making inquiries about land along a proposed route that would connect the existing railhead at Sweetwater to the timber-rich slopes of the Unicoi Range. The route that Denby's surveyors had mapped passed directly through a 120-acre tract owned by Silas Mercer, a strip of relatively level ground that ran parallel to the creek and offered the most economical path through the narrow valley. Denby called on Silas at the sawmill on the morning of April 19th and presented a formal offer of purchase, $8 per acre, which amounted to $960 for the entire parcel, a figure roughly 20% above the going rate for undeveloped timberland in that part of the county. Silas listened without comment, asked Denby to leave the written proposal, and said he would consider the matter. A week later, Denby returned with an improved offer of $10 per acre. Silas declined again. 3 additional offers followed over the course of May and June, each slightly higher than the last, and each met with the same flat refusal. By July, word had spread through Bell's Hollow that Silas Mercer was holding out against the railroad, and the speculation about his motives ranged from shrewd bargaining to simple stubbornness. A few neighbors suggested that Silas intended to demand an exorbitant price and retire to Knoxville. Others suspected that Eleanor, who had been born on that property and had never lived anywhere else, could not bear the thought of surrendering her family's land. What the neighbors did not know, and what no one outside the Mercer family would discover for nearly 2 decades, was that Silas Mercer's refusal had nothing to do with sentiment or negotiation. The tract that the railroad wanted contained something that could not be sold without exposing a system that Silas and Nathaniel had been operating for at least 8 years. Beginning in approximately 1879, the two men had engaged in a practice that would later be described by investigators as title manipulation. The mechanism was relatively simple. A clerk in the county recorder's office, a man named Vernon Carver, who had grown up in Bell's Hollow and whose sister had once been engaged to Nathaniel, provided the Mercers with advance notice whenever a neighboring landowner fell behind on tax payments or faced a legal judgment that might force the sale of property. Silas or Nathaniel would then approach the landowner, express neighborly concern, and offer to purchase the distressed property at a price that was generous enough to appear charitable, but far below its true market value. The transaction would be recorded normally. The landowner would be saved from public humiliation, and a few months later, when the original tax lien or judgment was quietly satisfied, the Mercer family would hold clear title to a parcel acquired for a fraction of its worth. The system had worked smoothly for years, generating profits that Eleanor tracked in a separate set of ledgers that were never shown to anyone outside the immediate family. By the spring of 1887, these ledgers documented the acquisition of at least 11 properties, totaling more than 400 acres, all obtained through some variation of the same basic method. The problem, as Thomas Mercer discovered during one of his periodic visits to the courthouse in June of that year, was that several of these transactions contained irregularities that a determined examiner could use to challenge the validity of the titles. Boundary descriptions had been copied incorrectly. Dates of filing did not match the corresponding entries in the county's master index. In 2 cases, the same parcel appeared to have been sold twice to different buyers. With only one of the transactions properly cross-referenced, the errors were not immediately obvious, but a railroad surveyor preparing a title abstract for the proposed route would almost certainly uncover them. If the inconsistencies became public, the Mercer family faced not only the potential loss of the disputed properties, but also the possibility of criminal prosecution for fraud. This was the real reason that Silas continued to refuse Arthur Denby's offers during the spring and summer of 1887. He was not driving a hard bargain. He was stalling for time while his son attempted to untangle the legal mess that he and Nathaniel had spent the better part of a decade creating. Thomas began visiting the courthouse in Madisonville 2 or 3 times a week throughout June and July, ostensibly conducting research on boundary lines and old surveys. The clerk who assisted him, a young man named Everett Sloane, who had replaced Vernon Carver after Carver's unexpected resignation in 1885, later recalled that Thomas seemed increasingly agitated as the weeks passed. He would arrive with a list of parcel numbers, request the corresponding deed books, and then spend hours cross-referencing entries while making notes on loose sheets of paper that he folded and tucked inside his coat before leaving. On one occasion, Sloane observed Thomas staring at a particular page in the deed book for nearly 10 minutes without moving, his face pale, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. Thomas left the courthouse that afternoon without speaking to anyone and did not return for nearly 2 weeks. When he finally came back, he requested access to the mortgage registry, a separate set of volumes maintained in a locked cabinet that required the county clerk's personal authorization to open. What Thomas found there, according to Sloane's later testimony, appeared to shock him. He closed the registry after only a few minutes, returned it to the clerk's office without comment, and walked out of the building with a gait that Sloane described as that of a man who had just received catastrophic news but had not yet decided how to react to it. The nature of that catastrophic news would not be fully understood until 1906, but the fragments that survived suggest that Nathaniel had been operating a second parallel scheme that neither Silas nor Thomas had authorized. While Vernon Carver still worked in the recorder's office, Nathaniel had used his access to file several mortgages against Mercer-owned properties, including the very tract that the railroad now sought to purchase. The mortgages listed the same Knoxville investment group that would later buy the Mercer holdings, and the documents had been backdated to make it appear that the encumbrances predated the original deeds. In effect, Nathaniel had quietly encumbered the family's land with obligations that only he knew about, creating a legal trap that would spring the moment anyone attempted to sell or transfer clear title. When Thomas discovered this in July of 1887, he understood immediately that Nathaniel had been preparing for exactly the scenario that was now unfolding. A buyer with deep pockets and legal resources that would inevitably expose the title irregularities, at which point Nathaniel could step forward as the creditor with the strongest claim on the most valuable parcels. The betrayal was so comprehensive and so carefully executed that Thomas reportedly spent 3 full days in his room at the farmhouse without speaking to anyone, emerging only on the 4th morning to confront his father with the evidence. The confrontation did not go as Thomas expected. Silas, when presented with the documents that his son had copied from the mortgage registry, reacted not with outrage, but with a kind of paralyzed dread. He acknowledged that the mortgages appeared fraudulent, that Nathaniel had clearly been acting without authorization, and that the entire family now faced legal jeopardy on multiple fronts. But when Thomas proposed taking the evidence to the county prosecutor, Silas refused. An investigation, he argued, would inevitably uncover the earlier scheme of title manipulation. The family's reputation would be destroyed. Criminal charges were almost certain, even if the Mercers could prove that Nathaniel had acted alone in filing the fraudulent mortgages. The discovery process would expose every questionable transaction that Silas himself had orchestrated over the preceding 8 years. There was no way to reveal Nathaniel's crimes without also revealing their own. The two were woven together so tightly that pulling on one thread would unravel the entire fabric. Thomas accepted this logic with visible reluctance, but Eleanor, who had been listening to the argument from the kitchen doorway, did not. According to fragments of her own later writings, she understood immediately that Nathaniel's scheme had placed the family in an impossible position, but she also recognized that refusing to act was, in itself, a form of surrender. The railroad would not wait forever. Arthur Denby would eventually grow tired of Silas's evasions and begin examining the title records himself, at which point the entire structure of fraud would collapse regardless of what the Mercers did or did not do. The only viable response, Eleanor concluded, was to gather her own evidence, not to prosecute Nathaniel, but to create a record that could be used as leverage. If Nathaniel could be made to understand that the family possessed documentation of his crimes, he might be persuaded to release the fraudulent mortgages and allow the property to be sold cleanly. It was a dangerous strategy, relying on a bluff that would only work if the threat was credible. But Eleanor saw no alternative. She began removing the ledgers from the sawmill office in late July, transporting them to the farmhouse in small batches and hiding them in various locations throughout the house. Some she placed under loose floorboards in the attic. Others she concealed inside the fireplace of a bedroom that had not been used since Silas's mother died in 1878. A few of the most sensitive volumes she entrusted to Ada, who carried them to the apothecary shop in Madisonville and locked them in a cabinet that Mr. Webb, her employer, believed contained only pharmaceutical supplies. Ada's role in the unfolding crisis was more active than anyone outside the family ever suspected. During the late summer of 1887, she began asking Horace Webb a series of carefully phrased questions about the properties of certain medicinal compounds. Specifically, she wanted to know whether there were substances that could produce symptoms resembling common gastrointestinal illnesses, nausea, vomiting, fever, and progressive weakness, without leaving traces that a physician of the period would be likely to identify. Webb, a cautious man who had been practicing pharmacy for more than 30 years, found the questions troubling. He later told investigators that he had asked Ada directly whether she was concerned about someone's health, and that she had replied in a tone he described as unnervingly calm, that she was merely trying to expand her professional knowledge. Webb did not press the matter further, but he noted the exchange in a personal journal that would not come to light until 1907. Ada's inquiries, combined with Eleanor's removal of the ledgers and Thomas's courthouse visits, suggest that by August of 1887, the Mercer family was no longer a single entity with shared interests, but a fractured coalition whose members were preparing for separate and potentially conflicting outcomes. Nathaniel, for his part, cannot have failed to notice the shift in the family's behavior. He was present at the sawmill every day, overseeing the books and conducting business as usual, and he must have observed that the ledgers were gradually disappearing from the office shelves. He must have noticed Thomas's absences during the courthouse visits. He must have sensed the conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the glances that passed between Silas and Eleanor when they thought he was not looking, the gradual tightening of the atmosphere in the farmhouse and the mill office. And yet, by all available accounts, Nathaniel's demeanor did not change. He continued to arrive at 7 o'clock each morning. He continued to wear his gold-rimmed spectacles and polish them with his vest cloth. He continued to speak in his soft, agreeable voice, and to offer peppermints and newspapers to his acquaintances in town. The performance was flawless, and it was precisely this unbroken composure that, in retrospect, seemed most terrifying to those who later tried to reconstruct the events of that summer. A man who could maintain such perfect equanimity while dismantling his own family's future was not merely dishonest. He was operating in a register of calculation that most people could not fully comprehend. Silas Mercer fell ill on the morning of September 12, 1887. He had been working in the mill office since dawn, reviewing a shipment manifest, when he suddenly complained of severe abdominal pain and asked Thomas to help him back to the farmhouse. By the time they reached the kitchen door, Silas was bent nearly double and sweating profusely despite the cool morning air. Eleanor sent for Dr. Lawrence Hodge, who arrived at the property around 11 o'clock and examined Silas in the downstairs bedroom. Hodge's diagnosis, recorded in his case notes and later quoted in the county's investigation, was acute gastric disturbance, likely of dietary origin, complicated by nervous exhaustion. He prescribed rest, a liquid diet, and a compound of bismuth and laudanum to ease the stomach pain. He assured Eleanor that her husband would recover within a week or 10 days, provided he did not attempt to resume work too quickly. Hodge was a competent physician by the standards of rural Tennessee in the 1880s, a graduate of the medical college at Nashville, who had been practicing in Monroe County for 22 years. His reputation was solid, and his diagnostic abilities were generally respected. There was no reason, at the time, to question his assessment. What happened during the 3 weeks that followed would later become the subject of intense speculation and conflicting testimony. Silas did not recover. His condition fluctuated, improving for a day or two and then worsening again, and by the end of September he had become too weak to leave his bed. Hodge visited the farmhouse 4 more times during this period, adjusting the treatment each time, but he never revised his initial diagnosis. Several neighbors who came to offer assistance were told that Mr. Mercer was suffering from a stubborn digestive complaint, and that the doctor expected him to be up and about before the first frost. Nathaniel, meanwhile, began telling a different story. In conversations with timber buyers, suppliers, and other business associates, he mentioned that Silas was gravely ill and unlikely to resume his duties at the sawmill. He spoke of it with practiced regret, shaking his head and polishing his spectacles, a man saddened by the decline of a respected elder, but resigned to the practical necessities of the situation. By the 1st of October, according to multiple witnesses, Nathaniel had effectively assumed control of all Mercer business operations, signing contracts, authorizing payments, and directing the mill hands as if the transfer of authority had already been formalized. Silas Mercer was declared dead on the 3rd of October. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Lawrence Hodge, listed the cause as gastric fever, duration 3 weeks. The body was transported to a funeral home in Madisonville, where it was prepared for burial without an autopsy. No one requested one. No one questioned the circumstances. Silas was interred in the family plot behind the Methodist Church in Tellico Plains on the afternoon of October 5th, with approximately 30 mourners in attendance. Nathaniel stood at the graveside with his head bowed, his spectacles in his hand, the picture of restrained grief. Eleanor stood apart from the other mourners, her face rigid and unreadable. Thomas did not attend the service, a fact that several attendees later recalled with puzzlement, though no one thought to ask where he had been. The second death certificate for Eleanor Mercer was filed on the 7th of October, just 4 days after her husband's burial, and only 2 days after she had been seen at the funeral service. The cause was listed as cardiac failure. The timing was startling, even for an era in which it was common for surviving spouses to decline rapidly after the loss of a partner, but the community did not question it publicly. The prevailing sentiment in Bell's Hollow was that Eleanor had died of a broken heart, a romantic notion that obscured the more disturbing questions that might otherwise have been asked. Where had Eleanor been between the funeral and her alleged death? Who had attended her in her final hours? Why was there no additional funeral service? No entry in the church registry, no notice in the local newspaper beyond the stark fact of the death certificate itself? And why, as would later be documented in sworn statements, had at least 3 people seen Eleanor Mercer alive on October 8th, the day after her official death? The third death certificate was for Thomas Mercer, dated the 10th of October. The cause was respiratory collapse. Like his mother, Thomas was reported to have died at home, attended by Dr. Hodge, and like his mother, his death generated no funeral notice, no obituary, and no documented burial. The Methodist Church had no record of a service. The funeral home in Madisonville had no record of receiving a body. Thomas Mercer simply vanished from the public record on the 10th of October, 1887, as completely as if he had been erased. The fourth and final death certificate was for Ada Mercer, dated the 14th of October, cause listed as complications of influenza. By this point, even the most incurious residents of Bell's Hollow had begun to whisper. 4 deaths in a single family in 11 days, with no visible funerals, no obituaries, and no bodies that anyone outside the family could claim to have seen. The circumstances were so peculiar that they would have attracted attention even without the existence of the statements that later surfaced. Statements from 3 named witnesses and 1 anonymous correspondent, all of whom claimed to have seen Eleanor, Thomas, or Ada alive after the dates on which the county had officially recorded their deaths. The most detailed of these statements came from a Mrs. Caroline Brewster, who operated a boarding house on the road between Bell's Hollow and Madisonville. Mrs. Brewster stated under oath in 1906 that on the evening of October 8th, she had observed a woman matching Eleanor Mercer's description walking east along the road, carrying a small traveling case and wearing a heavy veil. The woman had passed the boarding house at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, just as dusk was settling, and had continued walking until she disappeared around a bend in the road. Mrs. Brewster did not call out to her, nor did she think much of the sighting at the time, assuming that Mrs. Mercer was visiting a neighbor or attending to some family matter. It was only later, when she learned that Eleanor Mercer had supposedly died on the 7th, that the memory took on a different significance. The date she was certain of, because she had marked it in her household ledger as the day she received a shipment of flour from a mill in Sweetwater. A second statement came from Mr. John Ashby, a timber worker who had been employed at the Mercer sawmill for 5 years. Ashby claimed that on the morning of October 11th, a full day after Thomas Mercer's recorded death, he had seen Thomas walking along the creek bank near the sawmill, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of papers tied with string. Ashby called out a greeting, but Thomas did not respond, or even turn his head. He continued walking until he reached the tree line at the edge of the property and then disappeared into the woods. Ashby assumed that Thomas was preoccupied with family matters and did not report the sighting until he was questioned by investigators in 1906. The third statement was from a Mr. Orville Tate, who operated a livery stable in Tellico Plains. Tate stated that on the afternoon of October 16th, a young woman matching Ada Mercer's description had arrived at the stable and requested a horse and carriage for a journey to Sweetwater, where she intended to catch the morning train. Tate did not have a carriage available that day, but he offered to arrange a ride with a farmer who was making the trip the following morning. The woman declined and left the stable on foot. Tate remembered the encounter clearly because the woman had seemed nervous, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder as she spoke, and because she had given her name as Miss Webb, a name that Tate knew did not belong to any family in the immediate area. He did not connect the incident to the Mercer deaths until months later, and by that time he had no way of verifying what had become of the woman afterward. The anonymous statement was a brief note, unsigned and written in an unsteady hand, that simply read, "The doctor knows more than he told." It was found folded inside a ledger book in the county courthouse in 1906, along with the other documents that Samuel Whitaker would discover. Who wrote it and what specifically it referred to was never determined. The period between mid-October and the end of November was one of intense but largely invisible activity. On the 20th of October, Nathaniel Mercer appeared before the county probate judge and presented documents that he claimed granted him full authority to administer the Mercer estate. The documents included a will, purportedly signed by Silas Mercer in August of 1887, naming Nathaniel as executor and sole trustee of the family's holdings, as well as powers of attorney from Eleanor and Thomas that authorized Nathaniel to act on their behalf in all business matters. A later examination by experts in 1907 would conclude that the signatures on all 3 documents were forgeries, executed with sufficient skill to pass casual inspection, but containing subtle inconsistencies that a trained examiner could identify. The probate judge, however, was not a trained examiner, and he accepted the documents at face value. Nathaniel was granted the authority he sought. What followed was a liquidation remarkable for its speed and efficiency. On the 22nd of October, Nathaniel sold the 240-acre Mercer property, including the sawmill and all equipment, to the Knoxville Development and Land Company for a total of $3,200. The assessed value of the property at the time was approximately $9,500. The deed of sale was recorded the same day, with an unusual notation indicating that the transaction had been negotiated prior to the deaths of the family members and was being finalized posthumously at the agreed-upon price. No one at the courthouse appears to have questioned this explanation. On the 24th of October, A separate transaction conveyed the water rights along the creek and a right-of-way for railroad construction to a subsidiary of the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad for an additional $1,100. The combined proceeds of $4,300, less than half the true value of the assets, were deposited in a bank account in Knoxville under Nathaniel's sole control. On the night of November 2nd, a caravan of wagons arrived at the Mercer farmhouse. Neighbors who observed the activity from a distance reported that the wagons were loaded with furniture, household goods, personal effects, and what appeared to be boxes of papers from the sawmill office. The loading continued until nearly dawn, and by the time the sun rose on November 3rd, the farmhouse was substantially empty. A few days later, a representative of the Knoxville Development and Land Company arrived to take possession of the property. He found the doors unlocked, the windows shuttered, and the rooms stripped of nearly everything that might have identified the people who had lived there. The only items left behind were a few pieces of heavy furniture too cumbersome to move, a set of kitchen utensils that had been placed neatly in a wooden crate on the kitchen table, and a single framed photograph of the Mercer family, taken in 1881, that someone had left face down on the mantelpiece in the front parlor. What happened to Nathaniel Mercer in the years that followed can be summarized in a few sentences, though the full truth of his later life may never be known. He relocated to Knoxville in early 1888 and established himself as a partner in a modest land and timber enterprise that appears to have been partially funded by the proceeds from the Mercer liquidation. He purchased a house on Clinch Avenue, joined a Presbyterian church, and lived quietly, attracting no particular notice from his neighbors or associates. He never married. He never spoke publicly about the Mercer family or the events of 1887. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage on the night of February 16, 1896, at the age of 53, leaving an estate valued at approximately $14,000. If he ever expressed remorse, confessed to a confidant, or otherwise revealed what he had done, no record of it survived. Among the papers found in his desk after his death was a single sheet of stationery, blank except for the words, "Property of Nathaniel Mercer," written in his own hand across the top, beneath which someone, probably not Nathaniel himself, had written in pencil, "Or whoever pays most." The note was not included in the probate inventory and was only discovered in 1908 when his former housekeeper, cleaning out an attic trunk before a move, found it tucked inside a book of sermons. For nearly 2 decades after the liquidation of the Mercer estate, the story of what had happened in Bell's Hollow remained a matter of local speculation and fragmentary rumor. The deaths were attributed to disease. The sale of the property was understood as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of the family's extinction. The inconsistencies in the record, the death certificates prepared before the deaths, the absence of funerals, the sightings of people who were supposed to be dead, were either dismissed as errors or forgotten entirely. The community, like most rural communities faced with an uncomfortable mystery, gradually chose to stop asking questions. The Mercer name faded from conversation. The farmhouse stood empty for several years before being demolished by the Knoxville Development and Land Company in 1892, its lumber salvaged and sold, its foundation stones eventually reclaimed by the blackberry bushes that had always threatened to overtake the property. The sawmill continued to operate under new ownership, but it burned down in a fire of undetermined origin in 1901 and was never rebuilt. The only physical remnant of the Mercer family's presence in Bell's Hollow was the cemetery plot behind the Methodist church, where Silas Mercer's grave marker, a simple granite stone bearing his name and the dates of his birth and death, remained visible among the weeds for many years. The discovery that brought the Mercer case back to light occurred on the morning of April 4, 1906, a date that Samuel Whitaker would later describe in his private journal as the day the dead began to speak. Whitaker was 29 years old at the time, a native of Nashville who had recently been appointed as a deputy clerk for Monroe County after the retirement of the previous office holder. His duties included organizing and cataloging the county's older records, many of which had been stored haphazardly in a basement room beneath the courthouse, stacked in wooden crates and paper bundles that had not been touched in years. Whitaker approached the task with the diligence of a natural archivist, sorting documents by date and subject, flagging items that required preservation, and occasionally pausing to read entries that caught his attention. It was during this process, while working through a stack of tax ledgers from the 1880s, that he noticed something unusual. One of the ledgers, a volume covering the years 1885 through 1888, appeared to be slightly thicker than the others. When he opened it, he found an envelope that had been taped to the inside of the back cover, its edges yellowed and brittle with age. Inside the envelope, Whitaker found copies of 4 death certificates, those of Silas, Eleanor, Thomas, and Ada Mercer, along with the 4 witness statements, Eleanor Mercer's handwritten accounting of payments made by Nathaniel, and the anonymous note about the doctor. There was also a partly completed letter in Eleanor's handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, but clearly intended as a record of what she had uncovered. The letter, which ran to 3 pages of close-written script, described the scheme of title manipulation that Silas and Nathaniel had carried out over the preceding years, as well as Nathaniel's separate filing of the fraudulent mortgages. It did not directly accuse Nathaniel of anything beyond the mortgage fraud, but it made clear that Eleanor considered him responsible for placing the family in an impossible position. The final paragraph of the letter contained a statement that Whitaker would later quote in his official report. "I have placed copies of these documents in several locations, knowing that Nathaniel will destroy the originals if he finds them. I do not know what he intends to do next, but I am now certain that he has been preparing for this moment for longer than any of us understood. Silas believed that refusing to sell would buy us time, but Nathaniel never intended to allow a sale that he did not control. The mortgages he filed give him a claim on everything we own. If Silas dies before the matter is resolved, I do not believe that Thomas, Ada, or I will be safe." The letter was dated September 29, 1887, 4 days before Silas Mercer's recorded death. Whitaker, who had no prior knowledge of the Mercer case, initially assumed that he had stumbled upon evidence of a crime that had somehow escaped the attention of the authorities. He took the envelope to his superior, the county clerk, who listened to his explanation with an expression that Whitaker later described as one of profound weariness. The clerk, a man in his late 60s, who had held his position for more than 30 years, told Whitaker that the Mercer matter was best left alone. The people involved were either dead or gone. The property had been sold. No crime had ever been proven. Pressing the issue now would only stir up old resentments and accomplish nothing of value. Whitaker was not satisfied with this response, but he was young and new to his position, and he recognized the limits of his authority. Instead of pursuing the matter through official channels, he began his own quiet investigation. Over the course of the next 14 months, he located and interviewed the 3 named witnesses, Caroline Brewster, John Ashby, and Orville Tate, and persuaded each of them to provide sworn statements. He tracked down Vernon Carver, the former county clerk, whose sister had been engaged to Nathaniel, and found him living in Asheville, North Carolina, where he worked as a bookkeeper for a furniture manufacturer. Carver, who was by then in his mid-50s and suffering from a respiratory condition that would kill him 2 years later, initially refused to discuss the Mercer case. After several letters and a personal visit from Whitaker, however, he agreed to speak off the record. What he told Whitaker was not recorded in any formal statement, but Whitaker summarized the conversation in a private memorandum. Carver admitted that he had provided information about distressed properties to both Silas and Nathaniel during his tenure in the recorder's office, that he had been paid small sums for this service, and that he had resigned in 1885 after discovering that Nathaniel had used his access to file documents that Carver had not authorized. He refused to specify what those documents were, but he told Whitaker that Nathaniel was the most patient man I ever met, and the most dangerous for that very reason. Whitaker also attempted to locate Dr. Lawrence Hodge, but found that Hodge had died in 1902, having moved to Memphis in 1891, and established a practice that his son later described as modestly successful. The son, a physician himself, allowed Whitaker to examine his father's surviving case notes, which included a detailed record of Silas Mercer's illness and treatment. The notes were consistent with Hodge's stated diagnosis of gastric fever, but Whitaker noticed something that the son had apparently overlooked: a notation in the margin of Hodge's entry for September 28th, 5 days before Silas's death, that read simply, "Patient improving, fever reduced, expected recovery within 1 week." This notation directly contradicted the narrative of rapid decline that had led to Silas's death on October 3rd. If Silas had been improving on September 28th, what had caused his condition to reverse so suddenly in the following days? Hodge's notes provided no answer. The entries for September 29th through October 2nd were missing entirely, the pages apparently having been torn from the notebook at some point before Whitaker examined it. The most significant discovery in Whitaker's investigation came from an unexpected source. In January of 1907, while examining a box of uncatalogued court records from the late 1880s, he found a folder containing documents related to a lawsuit filed in the Monroe County Circuit Court in November of 1887. The plaintiff was listed as Thomas Mercer. The defendant was Nathaniel Mercer. The suit alleged that Nathaniel had obtained the Mercer family's signatures on the powers of attorney and the will through fraud and misrepresentation, and it sought an injunction preventing Nathaniel from disposing of the family's property pending a full hearing. The case file was incomplete. The complaint had been filed but never served, and the court had taken no action on the request for an injunction, but its existence proved that Thomas had not been dead on the 10th of October, as the death certificate claimed. He had been alive in Madisonville, actively attempting to stop Nathaniel from liquidating the estate. The timing suggested that Thomas had filed the lawsuit sometime between the 10th and the 20th of October, the date on which Nathaniel appeared in probate court. Why the lawsuit had never proceeded was unclear. A note in the file indicated that the complaint had been withdrawn by the plaintiff, but the withdrawal form was unsigned and bore no date. Whitaker speculated that Nathaniel had discovered the filing and had somehow persuaded Thomas to abandon it, perhaps by threatening to expose the family's earlier frauds or by offering some form of settlement that was never fulfilled. The alternative possibility, that Thomas had been prevented from pursuing the case by means more direct than persuasion, was not something that Whitaker was prepared to state publicly, but he noted it in his private journal and included the lawsuit file among the materials he preserved. Whitaker's investigation culminated in a report that he submitted to the county clerk in March of 1907. The report summarized the evidence he had gathered, noted the inconsistencies in the official record, and recommended that the matter be referred to the State Attorney General's office for further review. The clerk, who was by this time in failing health and increasingly disinclined to involve himself in matters that predated his tenure, acknowledged receipt of the report but took no action on it. The report was filed in a drawer not in the formal case index, and remained there unread by anyone but Whitaker for another 8 months. In November of 1907, a fire in the courthouse basement damaged a portion of the older records, including the tax ledger that had contained Eleanor Mercer's envelope. The envelope itself, which Whitaker had removed to his office for safekeeping, survived the fire. The ledger did not. The fire and the loss of the ledger's context effectively ended any realistic possibility of official action on the Mercer case. Without the original documents that had prompted Whitaker's investigation, and with the passage of more than 20 years since the events in question, the county had little incentive to pursue a matter that would be difficult to prove and politically awkward to explain. Whitaker, disillusioned by the experience, resigned his position in early 1908 and moved to St. Louis, where he found work as a clerk for a railroad company. He retained possession of the Mercer documents, the envelope, the death certificates, the witness statements, Eleanor's letter, the anonymous note, and the incomplete lawsuit file, and occasionally mentioned to acquaintances that he intended to write a book about the case. He never did. In 1912, he married a woman named Margaret Fisher, and the Mercer documents were packed away in a trunk that followed the couple through several moves over the following decades. Samuel Whitaker died of pneumonia in 1929 at the age of 52, and the trunk passed to his widow, who apparently did not know what it contained. When Margaret Whitaker died in 1946, the trunk was sold at an estate auction to a dealer in used furniture, who emptied its contents into a dumpster behind his shop. The Mercer documents were almost certainly destroyed at that point, though a fragment of the story suggests that a teenage boy named Harold Pinter, no relation to the later playwright, salvaged a handful of papers from the dumpster and kept them in his bedroom for several years before his mother threw them away during a spring cleaning in 1953. No one can confirm this. It belongs to the category of uncertainty that surrounds nearly every aspect of the case. What, then, actually happened to the Mercer family in October of 1887? The evidence that Samuel Whitaker assembled allows for a partial reconstruction, but the gaps are numerous and significant, and they will almost certainly never be filled. The most likely sequence, pieced together from the documents and supplemented by reasonable inference, runs as follows. Silas Mercer died on or about the 3rd of October, probably as a result of his illness, though the possibility that his death was hastened by some external agent cannot be ruled out given Ada's inquiries at the pharmacy and the missing pages from Dr. Hodges' notebook. Nathaniel, who had been preparing for this moment since at least the spring of that year, obtained death certificates for the remaining family members, Eleanor, Thomas, and Ada, through the cooperation of someone in the county recorder's office, almost certainly Vernon Carver's replacement, or an associate of Nathaniel's who had access to the official forms. The certificates were backdated or prepared in advance, the dates chosen to create a plausible timeline of sequential deaths that would allow Nathaniel to claim that the entire family had been wiped out by disease before anyone could question the rapid liquidation of the estate. Eleanor, Thomas, and Ada, however, were not dead. They had learned of Nathaniel's plan, probably through the same network of informants and careful observation that Nathaniel himself had used against them, and had fled separately, each believing that remaining in Bell's Hollow would result in either imprisonment for the family's earlier crimes or something more immediately dangerous. Thomas attempted to fight back through the legal system, filing the lawsuit that Whitaker would discover 20 years later, but he abandoned the effort for reasons that remain unclear. He attempted to return to the property at some point after the liquidation, probably to recover documents that could be used as evidence against Nathaniel, and was never seen again. Whether he met with an accident, fled under a new identity, or was silenced by Nathaniel or his associates is impossible to determine. A record that Whitaker believed might refer to Ada surfaced in 1919 when a woman using the surname Mercer Webb was listed as a witness to a marriage in Springfield, Missouri. The name combines Ada's own surname with that of her former employer, Horace Webb, the Madisonville pharmacist, suggesting a deliberate choice to signal her identity while maintaining a degree of concealment. No further trace of her has been found. Eleanor's fate is the least documented of all. She was seen walking east along the road on October 8th, carrying a traveling case, and then she vanished. No death certificate in her name, other than the fraudulent one, has been located in any state. No census record, no marriage license, no obituary, no grave marker. She simply walked out of the documentary record on that October evening and never walked back in. The Mercer case, as it has come to be known among a small circle of amateur historians and true crime enthusiasts, resists easy categorization. It is not a murder mystery in the conventional sense, because the only death that can be confirmed with any confidence, that of Silas Mercer, is also the one about which the fewest questions were asked. It is not a story of supernatural horror, though the image of a woman walking down a country road the day after her own recorded death carries a distinct chill. It is not a cautionary tale about greed or a tragedy of family dysfunction, or an indictment of the legal and medical institutions that failed to intervene. Though it contains elements of all these things, the case is, ultimately, a study in the power of documents to shape reality, and in the fragility of the line that separates truth from fabrication, when the only witnesses are either dead or complicit. Nathaniel Mercer did not kill his family with poison or a weapon. He killed them with ink, paper, and the unquestioning acceptance of a system that treated official records as indistinguishable from facts. The death certificates were all he needed. Once they were filed, Eleanor, Thomas, and Ada ceased to exist in the eyes of the law, and whatever happened to their physical bodies after that point was, from Nathaniel's perspective, merely a logistical detail. What makes the Mercer case genuinely disturbing, however, is not the method but the symmetry. Nathaniel used against his own family the same techniques that the family itself had used against its neighbors for nearly a decade. The title, manipulation, the reliance on inside information, the exploitation of legal loopholes, the assumption that documents would be accepted at face value, all of these were elements of a system that Silas and Nathaniel had built together, a system that had enriched them both and that they had surely believed they controlled. When Nathaniel turned that system against the Mercers, he was not inventing a new form of predation. He was simply redirecting an existing one. The family had created a machine for erasing other people's claims to property, and in the autumn of 1887, that machine was used to erase the family itself. This is the meaning of the sentence that Samuel Whitaker wrote on the last page of his report, the sentence that has been quoted in every subsequent discussion of the case. The greatest mystery of the Mercer affair is not who destroyed them, but at what point the family itself created the system that would eventually be used to erase it. The question has no answer, or at least no answer that can be extracted from the surviving documents. Perhaps it was in 1879 when Silas and Nathaniel first approached Vernon Carver and proposed their arrangement. Perhaps it was earlier, in the years after the Civil War, when Silas discovered that the county's record-keeping was too haphazard to detect a well-concealed fraud. Perhaps it was never a conscious decision at all, but the gradual accumulation of small choices, a boundary line adjusted here, a filing date altered there, until the family found itself so entangled in its own deceptions that escape was no longer possible. What is certain is that by the summer of 1887, the Mercers had reached a point where the truth could no longer protect them. The only thing that could save them was a different set of lies, and Nathaniel Mercer had already written those lies down, signed them, and filed them at the courthouse. The family had spent years making documents more powerful than people, and in the end, the documents won. The farmhouse in Bell's Hollow was demolished in 1892, as noted, and the land was eventually absorbed into the Cherokee National Forest, established in 1920. The site where the Mercer home once stood is now overgrown with second-growth timber, accessible only by a hiking trail that follows the old wagon road from Tellico Plains. Hikers occasionally pause at a stone foundation that protrudes from the undergrowth, the remains of the chimney that once rose from the eastern gable, and wonder aloud about who might have lived there. There is no historical marker. There is no interpretive sign. The Mercer name appears nowhere in the official literature of the forest. The only acknowledgement of the family's existence, apart from the documents that Samuel Whitaker preserved and that were probably destroyed in the 1940s, is the grave of Silas Mercer in the cemetery behind the Methodist Church in Tellico Plains. The church itself was replaced by a newer building in 1958, but the cemetery was preserved, and Silas's marker, weathered and partially illegible, remains in place. Visitors to the cemetery occasionally notice that there are no other Mercer graves nearby, despite the family's prominence in the community during the 1880s. No Eleanor, no Thomas, no Ada. The absence is conspicuous, and a few observant visitors have asked the church's pastor about it. The pastor, who has served the congregation since 1997, tells them that he has heard the story of the Mercer family but does not know the details, and that in any case the church has no records that would clarify the matter. He is not being evasive. The records simply do not exist. They were lost or destroyed or never created in the first place. The Mercers vanished from Bell's Hollow so completely that even the evidence of their vanishing has almost entirely disappeared.